communities that are linked to Britain in many ways, and it's also fading at the bottom. In Pakistan, they just did a survey and found that less than 20% of the people had anything good to say about the nation state. So, in this way, we can see that the nation states and what is the model of belonging that's going to arise after the nation state has in fact faded? And I think it is going to be a circumstance in which belonging and culture are actually going to take on more the form of the Anglo diaspora, where you are going to have these globalized communities, which are deterritorialized communities, which are linked with maybe invisible modes of communication often. Already that's true of, say, the Chinese diaspora. It'll be probably true of South Asian diasporas, Arab diasporas, then also a general sense of a Muslim diaspora, African, Hispanic, Portuguese, and so on, all of which are increasingly global. What happens to the nature of the contacts between them? Well, much could be said about that, but I don't have the time to say it, so thank you.
Thank you. Lots of very, very interesting things to explore in amongst that. I want to start by talking about the last piece. What do you think that knowledge about that prehistory, in a way, of multiculturalism and an ethnic presence in Britain, what do you think that tells us about identity here? I mean, does the fact that somebody can trace that there was a non-white presence in Britain 300 years ago as opposed to just 40 or 50 years, do you think that has an implication in terms of one's sense of belonging?
Look, I don't think it should, I mean, after all, say, a British person who goes to work in, say, Dubai doesn't need to think that, my ancestors were here, therefore I have a right to be here. It shouldn't work like that, really. I mean, in fact, we're really talking about situations often of expatriation. But yes, I'm sure that there are many, many young South Asians for whom it would make a difference to know that there was this deeply rooted sort of cultural presence of Asia in London. So I do think it's a very important project that Rosina and others have launched upon to excavate this history.
I just wanted to add my thoughts about, I think your book, Asians in Britain, is absolutely fantastic book. It really opened my eyes as well. So anyone who hasn't read that, it's a monumental book, I thought. I just want to drill into some of the things you said, because I think you painted a slightly benign picture of migration and its consequences, partly with your idea that the nation state is failing anyway. But it strikes me that if you're living in, say you're living in East London, and the last 50, 60 years you've seen the same community, basically white, basically English, and then over the last 30, 40, 50 years you've seen new waves of immigration coming through. And then you wake up and you don't recognise anyone on your street anymore. The restaurants are all offering food that you don't particularly like. This doesn't seem like your country. I mean, isn't there some point in, is there some validity in arguing something has changed?
Yes, of course something has changed. I mean, some things are changing all the time, really. And, I don't think that migration is ever an easy thing to adapt to, either for the host community or for the for the settler community. But I think it's a condition of human existence, And I think the illusion lies in expecting the opposite, in expecting, sort of undisturbed continuities, in expecting sort of, how shall I say, a sort of pure world. And that pure world is and always has been a myth. It's as much a myth in India as it is a myth in England. We know that enormous numbers of, leave aside the Lascars, gypsies, throughout the 19th century, the gypsy is so much a figure. The gypsy language, London language is saturated with gypsy language, And yet, where are the gypsies today? I mean, obviously, they faded into the wider communities. They mixed into them.
But you seem to be implying a sense of inevitability, whereas different countries have responded to that question in different ways. So there was an American model for how you deal with immigration. There's a British model. There's a European model. So the British model has been, I guess, one which has sort of tolerated difference and almost celebrated it to some extent, as opposed to an American model which says, as long as you all sign up to the flag. Do you think that the British model and the way that it's manifested itself have been dealt with better? I mean, are there different? How would you?
Look, I can't speak with any authority on this because it's not like I know all the details of the British model. But I do remember that, say, in the late 80s and so on, one of the things which was very troubling in Britain is that so much of the money that was given out for multiculturalism often went to the most right-wing, the most conservative elements of all the communities. You know, it actually fostered division. You know, what I do think is very important, and what we forget all the time, you know, with the collapse of socialism, it's one of the things which has really been forgotten, is that, you know, you have to have a model for living together. You have to celebrate the virtues of living together. And this was one thing, certainly, that, you know, that was celebrated in that period, that was spoken of in that period, you know. What has happened, I think, since the 80s onwards is this idea that, you know, that identity is a sort of, how shall I say, that it's an idol to be worshipped, you know. And I think that has really been a great problem for communities everywhere.
What do you think a citizen owes the government or the state? What should be the relationship between what the country owes its citizens and what the citizen owes the country?
That's a very good question, and I don't think it can really be answered in any very easy way. It's a very, very difficult question to answer because, you know, one thing we do know is that the sort of demand that, say, the United States has foundationally made upon people who live there, you know, who've chosen to become American citizens, is actually unrealistic. You know, you can't say any longer that you have this loyalty and no other loyalty. I mean, one of the questions that's asked in their citizenship exam is, are you willing to take up arms against your mother country, you know? And, you know, this whole idea that there's an absolute change, that there's a change, that it's like a conversion experience, that you become a different person. This is no longer a possible demand, you know. That whole model of migration, that whole idea of how people come from abroad and acculturate themselves, that's just not going to happen anymore. And indeed, you know, if you think about it, if you just think about it from the other point of view, those demands were never, for example, made of English people who settled in India. You know, they were never expected to become, as it were, culturally Indian. You know, or English people who settled in, say, Lebanon or Singapore or whatever. There was never that expectation. Why is that expectation a realistic expectation of, you know, people from other countries, other communities? So I think there has to be an equalization, you know, of those sorts of expectations and demands.
You've visited Britain over the last 25 years or so. As an outsider popping in every so often, give me your sort of sense of, give me a flash forward tracking of the last 25 years. How have you seen the country change?
It's changed enormously. Certainly, when I arrived in England, it was in 1978. I went straight off to Oxford, where I was in my college. You know, people don't believe this now. Sometimes when I tell them, you cannot believe how much racism there was. It was like every day you would have some incident. You know, a car would stop and people would lean out and say, "Walk, go home." Or, you know, you'd walk into a post office and the post office worker would say something incredibly nasty. And it happened, it wasn't just with street people. I remember, you know, there were several incidents of, in the colleges, Indian students having their rooms defaced. I remember in New College, a close friend of mine actually, who's now a leading political scientist in Delhi, she got up to go for matriculation and someone shouted, she was in New College, and someone shouted, you know, "Nigger, go home," or something like that. And it was just so much the commonplace of your everyday existence that you kind of, you just accepted it, really. But in the years after that, it really changed dramatically. I mean, by the by the mid 80s, by the late 80s, early 90s, that sort of verbal aggression, I think, became very rare. At least I never encountered it like that so openly again. And you began to see a lot of mixed-race couples, you know, in the streets, and there was a much greater sense of a kind of multicultural community. In that way, Britain changed very much, I think, between those years of the late 70s and 80s.
But one of the things I've noticed is that the people who came in the 60s onwards, they left, and there wasn't really any sense that they had much connection with back home anymore, apart from the occasional aerogram letter or whatever. But in the last 10, 15 years, because of flights, because of satellite television, because of phone calls, you can leave but not leave. And I'm wondering whether you think that has an impact on where you feel you belong.
It's absolutely the common existence of not just